Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take a stack of sources, pull out the most vital information, and basically hand you the shortcut to being truly well-informed.
And today, we're jumping into a really transformative era.
We are. Our deep dive is on the end of the Cold War, but we're looking at it specifically through the lens of the resurgence of American conservatism in the 1980s.
The sources you've pulled together give us a fantastic framework. Our mission here is to get past the simple timeline of events and really explain the causes and the effects of the Cold War's end.
Right. And to do that, we have to look at the domestic policies that funded it and then trace that legacy all the way up to today.
To how the U.S. really operates on the world stage now.
But to understand that huge shift in 1980, you have to realize it didn't just happen overnight. The political changes we all associate with Ronald Reagan were, well, they were the result of decades of conservative organizing.
Exactly. I mean, this movement, right. It had been building serious institutional power for a long, long time.
It's Goldwater, yeah.
Since Barry Goldwater's campaign back in '64, it was a coalition that slowly brought together, traditional Cold War hawks, fiscal conservatives pushing for lower taxes, and this is crucial, a newly mobilized moral and religious base.
The ones reacting against all the social changes of the 60s and 70s.
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this. So if the philosophy had deep roots, the immediate reasons for that 1980 shift were really painful and very immediate for the average American. We're talking about a sense of national malaise, really, a feeling fueled by economic chaos.
And that chaos was dominated by a word most people had never really dealt with before, stagflation.
Right.
This wasn't just inflation where your prices go up. This was high inflation happening at the same time as economic stagnation. Slow growth. The old economic tools, the Keynesian ones, they just weren't working.
And that led to a huge loss of confidence.
A deep loss of confidence in the government's ability to manage things.
And you couple that frustration at home with humiliation on the world stage? The energy crisis. Right. The oil embargoes meant gas lines, insane heating bills.
And then, of course, the Iran hostage crisis. It just played out on the nightly news for 444 days. It completely undermined this sense of American strength and national confidence.
All of this together just set the perfect stage for a candidate promising something radically different.
A return to strength and moral clarity. The 1980 election wasn't just another political victory. It felt like a societal rejection of the status quo.
And Reagan just executed it perfectly. He used his charisma, his comfort on television to become the face of this new conservative movement. And the result was a complete political realignment, a landslide.
489 electoral votes to Jimmy Carter's 49. I mean, the mandate was crystal clear.
So the new administration came in with a platform built on three core ideas.
Right, three really interconnected tenets. First, you have what we'd call Cold War conservatism. This was an aggressive, no-compromise resistance to communism. It was framed as a battle of good versus evil.
Second was the economic piece, pro-business economics. A huge commitment to cutting taxes and rolling back government regulations, all based on the idea that government was the problem, not the solution.
And that third leg of the stool was that powerful moral and religious conservatism. This was a political force directly opposing the counterculture, Roe v. Wade, the gay rights movement, all in the name of defending so-called traditional family values.
And those three ideas immediately started driving policy.
Which brings us right to the domestic revolution, Reaganomics.
So let's start with the theory. The engine behind all of this was something called supply-side economics.
And this was a radical departure. I mean, for decades, the consensus had been based on demand-side economics, the Keynesian idea that government spending boosts demand, which creates jobs.
Supply-side theory just flipped that on its head.
Completely. The core idea was that if you cut taxes, especially for corporations and the wealthy, they'd have more money to invest.
More capital for production, innovation, expansion.
Exactly. And that, in theory, would create jobs and boost productivity, and the benefits would eventually trickle down to everyone else.
And the main vehicle for this was the Economic Recovery Act of 1981.
Which was huge. A 25% income tax cut over 3 years, plus big reductions for corporations, capital gains, inheritance taxes. The sources are really clear that the cuts were designed to give the biggest immediate benefit to the highest earners to free up that investment capital.
Okay, but here is the great paradox of the era. They campaigned on fiscal responsibility, on cutting government spending, but the budget didn't shrink.
It exploded.
It exploded.
That's because the spending just shifted. The priorities changed. drastically. So while they did manage to cut around $40 billion from welfare programs, things like food stamps, job training,
They simultaneously kicked off the largest peacetime military buildup in American history. Defense spending went up by $150 billion over Reagan's 2 terms.
but wait, how did the administration justify that? I mean, running up a debt that large? Wasn't that the exact opposite of traditional conservative fiscal policy? Balanced budgets.
It was. But it was a conscious choice. A political tool, really. When you cut taxes and massively increase military spending at the same time, you get massive budget deficits. We're talking $200 to $300 billion a year.
And that deficit spending did two things. First, it did stimulate the economy, which helped end stagflation. But second, and this was crucial for the long-term conservative goal, these huge deficits made it structurally impossible for a future Democratic administration to launch big new social programs. There was simply no money.
So they were basically starving the domestic government beast.
Yeah, while feeding the military machine they needed for the Cold War.
Precisely. And beyond the budget, they went after deregulation in a big way. They just saw regulations as a drag on the economy.
And these were rollbacks across the board, right? Our sources point to reduced car emission and safety standards, but also opening up huge areas of federal land. Yes, that's a perfect example of the pro-business commitment in action. Opening federal lands for coal mining, for lumber, for offshore oil drilling. It often led to huge clashes with environmental groups, but the priority was wealth creation.
And this ideology didn't just stop with policy. It was cemented through the courts. You really can't overlook the judicial shift here.
No, it's arguably the most powerful and longest-lasting legacy of the whole era. The sources highlight 4 key Supreme Court appointments: Sandra Day O'Connor, William Rehnquist, Antonin Scalia, and Anthony Kennedy.
And appointing these conservative justices wasn't just about filling seats.
Not at all. It was an institutional reshaping. Their presence on the court created a long-term shift in how laws were interpreted, with a new focus on states' rights and individual property rights.
And what were the practical consequences of that shift?
Well, you see the courts begin to scale back affirmative action. You see them permitting states to put more restrictions on abortion and even limiting the scope of Miranda rights. The goal was to create a legacy that would restrain the federal government's reach long after the administration itself was gone.
So that entire domestic revolution, which was fueled by deregulation and debt, really provided the engine for the second critical part of the strategy, the assertive anti-communist stance abroad.
Exactly. The foreign policy was driven by that same clear moral framing we saw in the New Right's social platform. Reagan didn't see the Soviet Union as just some rival to be managed through dictatorship.
He saw it as a moral struggle.
A struggle between freedom and godless totalitarianism.
Yeah.
This was a fundamental change from previous administration.
And the rhetoric was just unforgettable. I mean, famously labeling the Soviet Union the evil empire in his 1982 speech. That wasn't just for Americans to hear.
No, it was designed to rally U.S. allies and to draw a very sharp, unambiguous line in the sand. And then, of course, years later in Berlin, that iconic line, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall."
It was so direct, so dramatic, it signaled that this administration was going to confront the Soviets, not just coexist with them.
And this rhetoric wasn't just talk. It was backed by that huge military buildup we discussed. More nuclear weapons, more conventional weapons. But the real strategic game changer was the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI.
SDI, introduced in 1983.
Right, which the media quickly nicknamed Star Wars. The concept was a space-based missile defense system. Now, whether it was ever actually technologically possible is still up for debate.
But that almost wasn't the point, was it?
It really wasn't. Its primary function was economic warfare. The Soviet economy was built on heavy industry and rigid central planning. They just didn't have the sophisticated microelectronics and computing power that SDI would require.
So the U.S. knew that forcing them into a high-tech, space-based arms race was a race they couldn't afford to run.
It was a war of attrition they were guaranteed to lose. It absolutely accelerated their internal economic collapse.
Alongside this, we saw small, quick military interventions, things designed to project this renewed American strength. Grenada in '83 is a classic example.
A very swift action after a Marxist coup. They restored a pro-U.S. government, and it sent a message to the world that America was willing to use force again.
So when we pull back and ask what actually ended the Cold War, it really seems to be a combination of factors that came together at the perfect time.
It was a perfectly timed synergy, really. You had this aggressive military and economic pressure from the U.S. hitting the Soviet economy right when it was already failing. But that pressure only worked because it was later paired with some very effective diplomacy.
The timing was just everything.
Absolutely. The diplomatic outreach, like the Geneva Summit in 1985, helped Reagan build a working relationship with the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev.
Who was already trying to reform the system from within, with perestroika and glasnost.
Exactly. And that personal relationship paved the way for real de-escalation.
Like the arms control agreements.
Yes, especially the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, in 1987. It eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles. That was the clear turning point. The final collapse came just a few years after that.
So if the Cold War was defined by this bipolar U.S. versus Soviet confrontation, the period that came after was defined by a shift toward, well, diplomacy and economic engagement, but all under this new umbrella of unchallenged American power.
And what's so fascinating is how quickly the U.S. had to pivot. It had to figure out its new role once the Soviet threat was gone. The world went from being bipolar to unipolar overnight.
So the question became, what do we do now that we're the only superpower left?
And the answer seemed to be a mix of promoting trade and using targeted military action when needed. On the economic front, you see new organizations like APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, which started in 1989 to promote trade, a sign of the coming globalization.
And then high-stakes diplomacy, like the U.S. brokering the Israel-PLO peace agreement, the Oslo Accords, in 1993. The U.S. was positioning itself as the world's essential mediator.
But military action didn't just go away. The sources make it clear that interventions continued, just in a different way. It was about protecting U.S. interests and enforcing this new global order.
The prime example being Panama in 1989.
Right. Operation Just Cause to remove Manuel Noriega. It demonstrated this new model of limited military action for specific goals without the fear of it escalating into a global conflict with the Soviets.
So this whole period, the end of the Cold War,
Yeah.
left the U.S. in this incredibly dominant position, but it also opened up a whole new set of very difficult questions.
It really did. This entire era sets the stage for the debates that we are still having today. What is the appropriate use of American military power? How much should we prioritize diplomacy versus force? How should we wield our economic influence? The blueprint from the 1980s is, in many ways, still the one we're using.
So for you, our listener, here are the key takeaways from this deep dive. The 1980s were defined by this simultaneous push for supply-side economics at home cutting taxes, deregulating industry paired with aggressive anti-communist rhetoric, and a strategic military buildup abroad, symbolized by SDI. These things weren't separate. They were deeply linked and were crucial in ending the Cold War, while also cementing a conservative legacy that's still with us today.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to consider based on the material we've just discussed. The end of the Cold War created new opportunities for diplomacy, like APEC and the Oslo Accords. But it also immediately ushered in this new era of U.S. military interventions, like in Panama, designed to manage this new world order. So the question is this. In the decades since, how effectively has the U.S. really managed to balance its role as the dominant world power-using military force when it sees fit with genuine multilateral diplomacy and long-term economic engagement?